3 True Rainy Night Horror Stories. Story 1. I worked the night shift at a medium-sized hotel in my town. Most of my shift was spent standing behind the front desk, checking guests in and out. On a typical night, not many people would pass through the lobby, so I mostly stood there, staring at the doors, waiting for any activity. Occasionally, I'd deal with grumpy customers or weird interactions, but that was just part of the job. One night, though, something happened that still stands out to me. It started off like any other night. The rain was pouring outside, and there was a storm brewing. When the weather's bad, nobody usually comes or goes, so I figured I'd just pass the time on my phone. A few minutes later, a man appeared at the entrance. He walked through the first set of doors, then stopped in the small vestibule between the 2 sets of glass doors. He looked around the lobby, made eye contact with me, and then awkwardly patted down his pockets. After a moment, he turned around and walked back out into the rain. It was a little strange, but I'd worked at a hotel long enough to know that people are often awkward, especially when they're in a hurry or distracted. I assumed he'd forgotten something in his car, like his keys, and needed to go grab them. What struck me as odd, though, was that I'd never seen him before, which wasn't entirely uncommon. Most people checked in during the day, and he didn't have any luggage with him. But I figured he was probably a guest who had already checked in earlier and just didn't have anything on him at the moment. A few minutes passed, and the phone rang on my desk. It was an outside number, so I knew it wasn't anyone calling from one of the rooms. I answered with my usual greeting, and a man's voice came through on the line. He said he was parked in the front lot and needed help bringing in his luggage. He seemed polite enough, but then he made a strange request. He asked if I could come out and help him with his suitcase. I was a little taken aback, but told him that if he pulled his car up to the front, I'd help him get his luggage situated. There was a long pause on the line before he finally said, "Okay," and hung up. I was a bit annoyed. After all, it was pouring outside, and I was not about to step out into the rain unless I had to. But I walked out from behind the desk and waited near the doors. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I grew impatient, so I stepped outside and looked across the parking lot. There he was, the same man from earlier, waving and motioning for me to come over. Something felt off. The whole reason I asked him to pull up to the door was to avoid walking out in the storm with his luggage. Why would he want to walk all the way over here in the rain? I decided to ignore him, closed the door, and went back to my desk. If he needed help, I figured he'd pull up to the front like I had asked. Just as I sat back down, the man came through the lobby doors. He'd somehow made it from the parking lot to the lobby, drenched and breathing heavily in record time. He walked up to the desk and asked me again to help him with his suitcase. I gave him the same answer. He needed to bring the car up to the front first. That's when things got weird. He said he'd already taken the suitcase out of his car and didn't want to put it back in. Red flags went up immediately. I asked if he had a room, trying to make sure he was actually a guest, but as soon as I asked, he got angry. His tone turned hostile, and he demanded I help him before he checked in. His luggage was getting soaked outside. At this point, I was done. I snapped back at him, telling him that if he'd left his luggage in the rain, that was his problem. And if he wasn't going to check in, I'd have to ask him to leave. That seemed to set him off even more. He turned around, flipped me off, and stormed out of the hotel. The rest of the night was uneventful, and when the morning shift came in, I told them about the man. As far as I know, he never came back to check in. Thinking about it now still creeps me out. He wasn't even a guest. Just some random guy trying to lure me outside in the middle of a storm. Story 2. I don't take road trips often. I prefer flying if I have to go somewhere far. But when a family member passed away unexpectedly, I had no choice but to drive the 10 hours to my cousin's house. I wasn't sure how long I'd be staying, so I packed enough for a week and hit the road the following morning around 10 a.m. It had been about 5 or 6 years since I'd driven this far, but I felt confident I could make the trip in one go without needing to stop at a hotel. A couple of hours into the drive, though, a storm started brewing ahead. By the time I hit the hour mark, I was driving through heavy rain and booming thunder. The roads were long and wound through flat plains, with stretches of small forest here and there. Some parts of the road ran through valleys, so all the water from the rain collected and flowed directly onto the road, which had almost no drainage system. This made me slow down significantly to avoid sliding off the road or getting stuck in a flooded patch. At one point, I hit a section of the road completely flooded and couldn't cross. I didn't want to risk getting stranded or having my car break down in the middle of nowhere, so I had no choice but to turn around and find another route. All these detours made the drive take much longer than planned, and after almost 8 hours on the road, I still had 5 hours to go. By then, the sun had set, and I was pretty wiped from having to concentrate so hard on driving through the storm. I realized I needed to find somewhere to rest before continuing. It took another 45 minutes of struggling to stay awake before I finally found a tiny town. And when I say tiny, I mean tiny, maybe 20 buildings, plus a few scattered farmhouses far off in the distance. I drove around looking for a motel, but of course, there was none. The best I could find was a small parking lot behind a local grocery store, so I pulled into the far corner. The town was dead quiet, with only a few streetlights on and not a single car in sight. The whole place gave me an eerie vibe, but at the time, I figured it was safer to park here than on the side of an empty road miles away from help. So, I locked my car, glanced around for a moment, then reclined my seat and shut my eyes. I know it wasn't the best idea, but the rain was still coming down hard, and I wasn't worried about anything happening during the night. I was exhausted, and the town felt safer than being out on some desolate stretch of highway. 10 minutes later, I fell asleep to the sound of the rain pounding against my car. But when I woke up, the storm had intensified, thunder crackling, lightning flashing, and the parking lot darker than before. I could just make out a figure moving in the distance, walking toward my car. I stared at them, hoping they'd turn off or go somewhere else, but the closer they got, the more I realized they were heading straight for me. It was hard to make out details in the rain, but once the figure got within about 20 feet, I could see it was a man. That's when I started feeling seriously creeped out. He was walking in the pouring rain, completely unfazed by it, and wasn't holding anything. I figured that at least he couldn't break into my car. When he got just a few feet away, he stopped. Instead of trying to open my doors or do anything obvious, he pressed both hands flat against the back door and started pushing, as if he were trying to shove the whole car. My stomach dropped. This guy was definitely crazy. I didn't know what to do, but I figured I had to get out of there. I turned the key in the ignition, started the engine, and switched on the headlights to let him know I was awake. He didn't even flinch. He just kept pushing, like his life depended on it. That was enough for me. I slowly started backing out of the parking spot, and he followed my car for a few steps, still keeping his hands on it. Finally, he let go, but he didn't move, just stood there and watched me as I pulled away. As I left the lot, he turned and started walking back in the same direction he came from. I didn't stop again the rest of the way to my cousin's house. Story 3. I live in Washington State, and at the time of this incident, I was living with my parents in our small, remote house. It was about 20 minutes from the nearest town, and our closest neighbors were half a mile away in each direction. This kind of isolation isn't unusual around here. Most of the area is vast forest, with small towns scattered in between and a couple of big cities far off. I'd grown up in that house, so I was used to the seclusion. It never made me nervous. But when I was 14, something happened that completely changed the way I felt about our location, and honestly, it still creeps me out to think about. It was spring break, and my parents had planned a trip to Florida. We were supposed to leave for the airport Sunday morning, but just days before, something came up at my dad's work, and we had to cancel the trip. To make it up to me, my parents took me to a water park on Sunday instead. It was fun, but I was still upset about the canceled vacation. We stayed for about 4 or 5 hours before a storm cloud rolled in, fast and dark. People started packing up, and we followed suit. By the time we got home, the storm had fully hit, pouring rain, thunder cracking, lightning flashing. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed something odd right away. The garage door was wide open. My dad assumed he'd forgotten to close it or that the sensor had gotten stuck. But my mom was sure she saw it close all the way when they left. We didn't think much of it at first, though. Maybe the wind had somehow pushed it open? So we got out of the car and made our way inside. My mom pressed the button to close the garage door again, and it shut without any problems. My parents plopped down on the couch to watch TV, and I made my way upstairs to my room. The rain was coming down harder now, filling the house with a constant rumble. But as I was halfway up the stairs, I thought I heard something moving in the hallway. I froze, straining my ears to listen. It was faint, like something small scurrying between boxes, but I figured it was just an animal. I continued up the stairs, but then I noticed something odd. My bedroom light was on. I hadn't turned it on when I left that morning, and I definitely wouldn't have left it on if I had. At that point, I wasn't sure what to think. Maybe I had forgotten, or maybe it was something weird with the wiring. Still, I was uneasy. I stood outside my room for a moment, listening, trying to calm myself down before going in. After a few moments of silence, I heard it again, a soft shuffling sound. It was so faint I could barely make it out, but it sounded like a small rodent moving between boxes in my room. I cracked the door open, expecting to see a rat or something running around. But there was nothing. I stepped in, closed the door behind me, and started looking around. My room looked completely normal. Usually, if an animal had gotten in, there'd be some kind of mess. But there was nothing. I crouched down and peered under the bed, then checked the floor for signs of any disturbance. Again, nothing. I sat on my bed, trying to make sense of all the weirdness. But as I was sitting there, something caught my eye, a shadow moving across the bottom of my door from the hallway. My heart stopped. The shadow was too big to be an animal. It was a person. I immediately jumped up, my mind racing. I was trapped in my room unless I wanted to risk running out into the hallway. I grabbed my phone and quickly texted my dad. Someone else is upstairs. The message turned red almost instantly, meaning he had seen it. I could hear him coming up the stairs immediately. I stood by the door, my pulse pounding in my ears as I listened to his footsteps. Then, just a few seconds later, my door creaked open. My dad looked at me, concern in his eyes, and I whispered everything I had seen. He could tell I was scared. Without saying another word, we quietly moved down the hallway and toward the stairs. But just as we reached the bottom, there was a loud thud from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of running footsteps down the hall. My dad rushed into the living room, grabbed a small bat from the corner, and we sprinted to the front door. We turned the corner and saw the front door wide open, and a man in the distance, running away, disappearing into the stormy night. My dad called 911, but because of how remote our house was, it took nearly 30 minutes for them to arrive. The officers spoke with my parents, asked me a few questions, and searched the area, but they didn't find anything. As far as we know, the guy was never caught. The officers said they thought someone must have known we were supposed to leave for vacation that morning, and that's likely how they knew we'd be gone. It still sends chills down my spine to think about it. What really unsettled me was the idea that the person who broke into our house was someone who knew us, someone we might have talked to. It makes you wonder who your true friends really are. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and we will see you in the next video.